A routine traffic stop spiraled into something far more intense when the officer realized just who he was dealing with. The late afternoon sun bathed the quiet suburban streets of Fairview Heights, Missouri, in a warm golden glow. Angela Carter, poised and self-assured, navigated her sleek black Tesla through the tranquil neighborhood. A woman in her early 40s, she exuded confidence, her thoughts drifting to how much she had achieved. But then, without warning, red and blue lights shattered the calm, flashing brightly in her rearview mirror. The sharp wail of a siren sliced through the stillness, jolting Angela from her reflections. Her pulse quickened, not out of fear, but frustration. She hadn't broken any laws, her speedometer confirmed it. Still, duty called. With a flick of her turn signal, she pulled over smoothly, exhaling deeply as the patrol car rolled to a halt behind her. Officer Dan Baker emerged, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried an imposing presence, his expression stern, lips pressed into a thin line. As he approached her vehicle, Angela pressed the button to lower her window, her face calm yet alert. Before she could utter a word, the officer leaned down, peering inside with an intensity that made her fingers tighten around the steering wheel. "License and registration," he barked, his tone clipped, devoid of warmth or courtesy. Angela retrieved the documents with deliberate movements. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. His eyes narrowed. "I'll be asking the questions here. Step out of the vehicle." No explanation followed, no context given. Angela hesitated, not out of defiance, but because she knew her rights. There was no legal reason for her to comply, and he hadn't provided one. Her reluctance seemed to infuriate him further. "I said step out of the vehicle," he snapped, his voice rising enough to draw curious glances from passers-by. Angela locked eyes with him, refusing to back down. She understood this was only the beginning. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, signaling that this encounter was far from resolved. Her composure appeared to irritate Officer Baker even more. His hand hovered near the holster of his gun, not drawing it, but the message was clear. Angela noticed, but refused to let it rattle her. Instead, she held his gaze, unflinching. "Officer," she said firmly, "I'm happy to comply if you can provide a valid reason for asking me to step out." Her voice remained steady, measured. His jaw clenched as he leaned closer to the window. "You're acting suspicious. This is my call, and I don't have to explain myself to you." The dismissive edge in his tone rang louder than the authority he tried so hard to project. Angela exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to escalate. Instead, she unlocked her door and stepped out, standing tall despite the officer's looming presence. Dressed in a navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, her appearance was impeccable. If Baker noticed, he didn't show it. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, stepping back slightly as though expecting her to make a sudden move. Angela complied, raising her hands slightly, a gesture that felt both unnecessary and demeaning. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a distance, their murmurs growing louder. "You're driving an expensive car in an area where we don't see too many visitors," Baker added, letting the implication linger in the air. Angela's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Are you saying I don't belong here?" Baker smirked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm saying it's my job to make sure everything checks out." "Where are you headed, ma'am?" "Home," she replied simply. "I live here." The officer raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched across his face. "Is that so? Care to prove it?" Angela opened her mouth to respond, but a voice cut through the tension. "Leave her alone." "She hasn't done anything," someone shouted from the crowd. Baker whipped around, glaring at the onlookers. "Mind your own business," he growled, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Angela seized the moment. "Officer, I'd like to remind you that I'm fully cooperating. But your behavior is inappropriate and unprofessional. If you have nothing further, I'd like to go." His face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and anger flashing in his eyes. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near growl. "You don't tell me how to do my job." But Angela wasn't backing down. The tension crackled like electricity, and everyone watching could feel that this confrontation was hurtling toward an inevitable breaking point. Under Baker's simmering glare, Angela stood resolute. She had faced men like him before, men who believed authority granted them the right to belittle and intimidate. Yet she also knew the power of staying composed. Every word, every gesture, every pause was a calculated choice. And right now, Angela chose to let Baker dig his own grave. "Officer," she began, her voice calm but edged with steel, "I'm well aware of my rights. Unless you have probable cause or evidence that I've committed an offense, you have no grounds to detain me." Her words were deliberate, measured. The crowd murmured in approval, emboldened by her confidence. Baker, however, looked like a kettle about to boil over. He straightened his stance, attempting to regain control. "I don't need a lecture on the law from you," he snapped. "You think you can talk your way out of this because you're—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung heavily in the air. Angela tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "Because I'm what, officer? Educated? Successful? Black?" The last word landed like a thunderclap, silencing the crowd. Baker's face darkened, but Angela didn't give him a chance to respond. "You should know," she continued, her tone unwavering, "that I have no problem escalating this if necessary. This encounter is being documented." She gestured subtly toward the discreet dash cam mounted on her windshield. Baker's eyes darted to the camera, his bravado faltering for the first time. "You can't intimidate me," he muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I'm not trying to intimidate you," Angela replied, her tone soft but firm. "I'm trying to hold you accountable." For a moment, it seemed as though Baker might relent. His eyes darted between Angela, the camera, and the watching crowd. But pride wouldn't allow it. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "You're playing a dangerous game," he warned, his voice low enough for only her to hear. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. "So are you." The weight of her words hung heavy between them. Baker's hand twitched at his side, his confidence visibly cracking. But Angela knew the storm wasn't over yet. She could see it brewing in his restless eyes. The air grew thick with tension as Baker stared at her, his ego wrestling with the reality that his authority was slipping away. Angela remained steadfast, her gaze unwavering. The crowd, though silent, seemed to hum with anticipation. It was a moment balanced precariously on the edge of a knife, and Angela knew it was time to tip the scales. "Officer Baker," she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a bell, "do you know who I am?" Baker sneered, masking his unease with defiance. "I don't care who you are." Angela took a small step closer, her calmness unnerving. "You should. I'm Angela Carter, the head of internal affairs for the state of Missouri." Her words hit like a thunderclap, rippling through the crowd. Gasps spread among the onlookers, and even Baker's face betrayed a flicker of panic before he masked it with a forced scowl. "You're lying," he said, though his voice faltered. Angela didn't flinch. "Feel free to verify it. Call your station. Pull up my credentials. I oversee the conduct of every officer in this state, including you." Baker's bravado cracked like thin ice under pressure. He took a step back, his mind racing, his body betraying his disbelief. His hand dropped from his holster as he shifted awkwardly, suddenly aware of the cameras, the crowd, and the damning nature of his behavior. Angela pressed on. "This entire interaction has been recorded," she said, her voice calm. Her voice carried an edge of authority that commanded attention. "Your actions will be reviewed, your conduct scrutinized, and I will personally ensure that justice is served." Baker's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no clever retort, no way to reclaim control. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and it was evident to everyone watching. One bystander, a young man with his phone raised, shouted, "Yeah! You better listen to her." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Angela's quiet strength. Baker took another step back, now visibly sweating. I didn't mean any disrespect," he stammered, his tone suddenly conciliatory. Angela raised an eyebrow. "Your actions say otherwise, officer. I suggest you reflect on that." For the first time, Baker looked small. His earlier arrogance dissolved into palpable discomfort. But Angela didn't gloat or revel in his humiliation. Instead, she turned to the crowd. "You all can go home now," she said gently. "There's nothing more to see here." The onlookers began to disperse, though not without casting parting glances at Baker, whose shoulders sagged under the weight of his own misdeeds. Angela watched as he retreated to his patrol car, but she knew this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning of a much-needed reckoning. Inside the vehicle, Baker gripped the steering wheel tightly, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His mind raced through the events that had just unfolded. He could still feel the weight of Angela Carter's words pressing down on him. "I oversee the conduct of every officer in this state, including you." The sentence replayed over and over in his head, each iteration chipping away at the confidence he'd clung to so fiercely. Nearby, Angela stood by her car, waiting patiently as Baker fumbled with his radio, likely verifying her identity. She didn't need to eavesdrop to know the outcome. Her posture exuded quiet resolve, a testament to the fact that she'd faced far tougher battles than this one. And she certainly wasn't about to let this incident slide. Minutes later, Baker emerged from his vehicle, his once commanding demeanor now subdued. He approached Angela with his head slightly lowered, the bravado he'd displayed earlier replaced by something akin closely to shame. "Miss Carter," he began hesitantly, "I've spoken to my superiors. I understand who you are now." Angela met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Good. Then you understand the gravity of what just happened." Baker nodded stiffly. "I apologize if I overstepped." Angela tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Overstepped, officer? What you did wasn't a simple overstep. It was an abuse of power, rooted in bias and intimidation. Do you even realize how dangerous your actions could have been?" Baker opened his mouth to respond but quickly shut it again. The weight of her words sank in, and for the first time, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Angela continued, her voice unwavering. "As an officer of the law, you're sworn to protect and serve. Yet today, you chose to profile and harass. Imagine if I hadn't been in the position I'm in. Imagine if I had been someone without the means or knowledge to defend themselves." Baker's shoulders slumped further, the realization of his actions crashing down on him. He looked at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I was wrong." Angela nodded. "Acknowledging your mistake is a start, but it's not enough. You need to reflect on why you acted the way you did and take steps to change. This isn't just about you, it's about the system you represent." The crowd had long since dispersed, leaving the two of them standing there in the fading light of the afternoon. Baker nodded again, his voice almost a whisper. "I'll do better." Angela stepped back toward her car, opening the driver's side door. "I'll be watching to make sure you do. And believe me, Officer Baker, I'll hold you accountable if you don't." As she slid into her seat, Baker remained rooted to the spot, the full weight of the moment settling heavily upon him. Angela drove off, leaving behind a man who now had to confront not only the consequences of his actions but also the deeper flaws within himself. As Angela drove home, the tension of the encounter slowly began to dissipate. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, her expression steady but thoughtful. This wasn't the first time she had faced discrimination, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But today felt different. Today, she hadn't just defended herself, she had sent a message: accountability wasn't optional. Back at the precinct, Officer Baker sat alone in the break room, replaying every word Angela had said. Her calm authority had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. For years, he had operated under assumptions, never questioning the biases that guided his actions. But now, he couldn't ignore the harsh reality staring back at him. His badge didn't make him right, and his power wasn't an excuse to demean others. Angela's words echoed in his mind: "Imagine if I hadn't been in the position I'm in. Imagine if I had been someone without the means or knowledge to defend themselves." He realized how often his decisions could have caused harm, and for the first time, he felt a genuine desire to do better. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Meanwhile, Angela parked in her driveway and stepped out, the evening breeze brushing against her face. She paused, looking up at the sky as stars began to dot the horizon. Her work was far from over, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change didn't come all at once, and progress was often messy. Still, moments like this reminded her why she fought so hard to challenge injustice. Her story wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated. Angela knew the power of speaking up, of standing firm, and of holding others accountable, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. As she walked inside, a sense of determination fueled her steps. This wasn't just a battle she had won, it was a step toward something greater. Her encounter with Baker would ripple through the precinct and beyond, a reminder that justice was more than a word, it was an action. In the end, the lesson was clear: true power isn't in authority, it's in accountability. And justice, no matter how delayed, always has its moment. If this story moved you, don't let the conversation end here. Share this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us all of the power we hold to make a difference.